Okay, this will be Chapter 15 of the State and Local Government course, looking at education policy. And as we'll see, the education takes up the biggest chunk of state and local budgets. This was the pie chart that we looked at during taxing and spending. So if you look at elementary and secondary education and combined with higher education, that's 30% of state and local budgets, and $800 billion total. It's about $10,300 per pupil. And we started to see as we got into the 2000s that there was, particularly on the federal government, there was more of a push towards getting federal standards in order to try to shore up our education system. As we'll see here in a minute, there's lots of concerns about Americans' education system. Congress passed $12 billion in mandates for the states to do as far as improving their education. And so this provides additional costs to the states for annual testing in particular. That is part of our federalist system, but also part of the friction between federal government and states when federal government requires states to do something, but then the states have to come up with a way to pay for it. So despite the United States' higher per pupil spending, when you look at comparisons across the world, United States students rank poorly, particularly as grade level rises. We'll look at some numbers here in a minute. Education, as I said, is the largest expense of state and local budgets, and we have had mandatory standardized testing for a long time, but there's also been increasing standardized testing in addition to the SAT and ACT as far as more or less annual performance assessments, that sort of thing, that are testing not just the students but the school's performance. And we also see that over the years, the SAT, ACT scores, which demonstrate for that particular cohort of all the students in the United States as to what their assessments are for reading, math, writing, we see that they have been trending downwards. Here is particularly quite a bit since the 60s, fairly big downward trend, and then it leveled off, and we are seeing, as we get into the 2000s, despite more attention, we still see that SAT, ACT scores are still declining in general. So here's the NAEP assessments, and what is interesting to note here is that particularly since the 70s, we have started to see a slightly upward trend for 9 and 13 years olds, but not for 17 years olds, as you can see right here in the conclusion. And this may also be a reflection of, as students get older in high school, they're a little bit more disengaged from their parents. The younger you are, more parental involvement is more than likely correlating to those improvements there, but starts to level off as you get older into high school. Now, the cross-country comparison is even more alarming, which spurs a lot of policy action in the United States down here. We are pretty far down on the list, comparatively speaking, with other OECD countries. Now, these are the countries. There's approximately 35 countries in the OECD, the richest countries of the world. And the United States is pretty far down the list, comparatively speaking, somewhat surprisingly so, considering we are the richest, most prosperous. We are slightly above the average here when you look at all the OECD countries, but even more alarming perhaps is that when it comes to the math, we are clearly underneath the average when it comes to math assessment, and about right on the average there for the science scale. So this has been building for a long time, and so United States policymakers have been increasingly trying to figure out what's happening. And so we've got two things, well, lots of things working here, but as standards, perhaps um, in order to try to bring scores up, things like writing and math might start getting a little bit more de-emphasized. We're also starting to see, as far as what we can test, less analytical thinking, increasing industry ignorance of history and government. Those are some of the things that we've seen in our education system. We see that curriculums are perhaps getting softened in some ways in order to try to perhaps boost grades up, which is kind of counterproductive if you're trying to boost your grades up and just making it easier in order to kind of see grades go up. That's counterproductive. That's not necessarily solving the problem. And lack of motivation of students, we may be seeing a general trend downward on that, on motivation. Again, we're looking at some societal factors here. How much priority do we put on education as we're getting socialized into the system? Parental guidance may be on the decline, which is clearly one of the biggest factors, particularly as far as getting students motivated and perhaps even directed towards more education. Single parent households just have fewer resources that can provide for children, which we do see that there is a correlation, a small correlation between socioeconomic status and education. And we also see that two working families, both husband and wife working, takes time away from the children, so less parental guidance there as well. And it's hard not to see, particularly since the 90s, with increased internet, social media, smartphone, digital devices, social networking, it's hard not to see a correlation with the increased distraction, even though we've got access to a near infinite treasure trove of information. Our digital media is not really being used for that. It's being used for the things that are more fun to us: communicating, networking, socializing, among other things. Teachers are fairly low paid on average, particularly compared to other countries, and so that certainly would affect the quality of teachers that you could get, particularly in K through 12. Poor quality of teachers, and again, this might be hard to measure as far as what makes a teacher a high quality or low quality teacher, but if that's translating in the classroom, that creates more indifference of the students. We do know in the United States that teachers have considerably less prestige, and so that is reflected in the low pay the teachers get. We also that unions, as part of what they're tasked to do, is to protect their workers. Well, they could also potentially protect incompetent or low quality teachers from losing their jobs, and so that would continue to sustain poor teacher quality. And then another thing that you would talk about even more so in a sociology class is that a lot of time is taken up in class by teachers as far as just maintaining order and control, discipline, other factors that are playing into distracting students from their studies, such as drugs. So as you can see, there's lots of factors that are part of this big equation as to why education is on the decline in America, and why state and local government policymakers, as well as federal government, are starting, have been for a while, trying to figure out how to address this. Teachers, because it's a low job pay, and it's a fairly stressful job, particularly trying to maintain attention of very young students. One half of them quit the job within 5 years, and expecting a teacher shortage as a result of that. And so again, some other things may have to be done at the government level to try to incentivize more teachers as well as higher quality teachers. Now, this might have been a little bit more interesting if they'd ranked the states in order rather than just alphabetically, but you can see here as far as how the state ranks as to how much they spend on education, and then how that might clearly teacher salary would probably rank closely with the total expenditures. But as we see, graduation rate does not necessarily correlate directly with how much you spend. So we can look at some of these. For example, Indiana, well, Alaska, of course, is 4th in expenditures, but 34th in graduation, whereas Indiana is 47th. This is pretty fascinating here. Indiana is almost last in how much they spend, but number 1 in their graduation rate. So how do you explain that? So we've got clear correlations between expenditure and teacher salary, obviously, but not much correlation here when you look at expenditures versus graduation rank. I have a few here that are ranked fairly close, but here you see Rhode Island 5th in expenditures, but 47th in graduation rate. So that means that just throwing money at the problem is not going to solve the problem. Yes, obviously, more resources that you have with your schools, the higher paid teachers you have, again, you should see, and all other things being equal, you should see some better results, but it's no guarantee to solve the problem. Bureaucracy in schools is also growing as well because of what of all the functions that schools also have to do in order to keep up with their students. Ratios as high as 1 employee per 8 teachers, and it's probably higher than that when you look at the college level. And we also see that, we'll talk about school choice here in a little bit, but because of the fact that schools have school districts, and those districts are governed by school boards who raise funds, particularly through property taxes, and that the people that live in those districts traditionally go to those schools, so that the school system is somewhat like a classic monopoly in that sense. And so since all the kids in that region have to go to that school, you may be getting less accountability, but yet more rules on the bureaucratic side. And clearly, there's very little effect on increasing administrative or bureaucratic functions as to improving school effectiveness. There's really, the bottom line is that the teachers are teaching the kids in the classroom. Now, as far as the intergovernment roles, we've mentioned this before, most schools are operated by these independent school districts. The states are what we refer as the dominant policymakers. They're setting the curriculum, approving the textbooks, setting the teacher pay, other things like gradings and curriculums and ratios. And then what they do is they leave the details to the local decision makers. And then when you get right down to it, the most important details are left in the classroom to the teacher, who has very little supervision as to how they teach that. They obviously have rules that they have to follow and testing requirements, but as far as how they actually impart that information to the students, that's quite a bit of autonomy there. So it works itself all the way down to the teachers having to deliver the information. And because of this decline and these concerns, state involvement has intensified. We've got lots of inequalities between school districts that we've already talked about, and we're starting to see that we might be losing confidence in our education system if things continue to decline. What is that going to do for the future of our society when this next generation is going to have to face and address and hopefully solve very big major problems, and you're going to need to be educated to do that. The federal role in education was initially pretty minimal because the federal government delegated that down to the states. This Education Act, pretty important landmark in 1965, a national subsidy. This was again during the Johnson Great Society years, where we also enacted programs to eliminate poverty, as well as created Medicare and Medicaid. And Head Start was also included in this period here to provide more funding and initiative for kindergarten, preschool type programs to get kids started early. And national subsidy was provided for every district, so federal funding got more involved. The U.S. Department of Education was not even created until 1979, and depending on the politician that's running for office on the federal level, that department does seem to be an easy target for elimination. If we want the states to do this, then why not eliminate the federal Department of Education? Of course, it hasn't, and it's unlikely that it will, because of this growing concern for getting the entire country's education system up to be improved. So therefore, the federal role might actually increase even more, perhaps to try to get all the states more together on standards. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute, but you can see the federal expenditures have increased dramatically, 4.5% in 1960 to about 10% today. 10% still sounds like a fairly small amount, but that's a pretty dramatic increase since the 1960s. As far as the federal role, as I said earlier, the federal government started to get a little bit more active in the early 2000s. The President of the United States was actually elected on an agenda to try to bring up our education standards on a nationwide basis, and the No Child Left Behind program was implemented in 2002 that set national performance goals and testing mandates. The results are clearly been mixed, because we see that our performance assessments have still been decreasing since 2002. And there's obviously, with our federal system, that states push back on federal mandates. Lots of suits were filed against that. Waivers were granted for states to perhaps not have to comply with certain things. And of course, part of that No Child Left Behind, as well as the Race to the Top, which was the Obama administration that tried to initiate a little bit more competition between states for grants to improve their education system rather than have requirements imposed upon them. Slightly different approach there, but by 2012, the report card there from these programs showing almost half of schools declared to be failing. So this is why this is a pretty serious situation, and why we're talking about it on the state and local government, because that's one of their primary responsibilities. Property tax funding, which is the vast majority of funding for schools in these school districts. And if the properties are more valuable in one neighborhood than another, so you get more funding in one district than another, that leads to inequalities, particularly in teacher pay and resources available. And some of these inequalities have been found unconstitutional. That's why states have tried to enact some sort of redistribution programs for funding to go from very wealthy districts to poor districts. Now, in 1973, this is also part of our federalist system, where the courts will rule almost kind of back and forth between favoring the states or not favoring the states. So in 1973, a Supreme Court decision found that education is not a fundamental right. That's just perhaps a cultural norm, that it's, yes, we put a lot of value on education, but not necessarily that you're guaranteed to have it, even though we provide it as a public good. So again, very back and forth when it comes to these types of rulings. And so that decision left it back up to the states' constitutions to determine whether that would be how they would fund that. And I already talked about the equalization formulas to try to help poor districts where and then certain foundation programs that set a minimum level per pupil, and then looking at other things as far as increasing the amount of various fees that schools can charge to raise revenue. Now, as far as revenue sources, we see that the blue line here is state government. So state government has picked up a little bit, but as we get in the 80s, everything's pretty much leveled off as far as percent of total revenue. Dropped dramatically from the early 1900s as far as local government. That's where we saw considerably more school districts, and it started to consolidate. So they've kind of leveled off, whereas federal government spending has leveled off for a while, but perhaps spiked a little bit really as we get into the new century here, and kind of leveled off again. What are some alternatives to the property taxes? Well, some districts have looked at using sales taxes to help provide that. We also have already talked about sin taxes as far as taxing the behaviors such as cigarettes and alcohol that can raise revenue. We also mentioned that the lotteries, which raise a little bit of revenue, some of that going to the education program. And then the income taxes, there are a few states that still don't even have a state income tax. Those are some other avenues. And as I said before, though, while money certainly can improve the quality of the school, the resources that the school has, the facilities, perhaps even teacher pay, but as we saw in that previous chart, there's no consistent relationship between spending more dollars and increasing performance. There's no guarantee. What we have found is that family, socioeconomic background, as it is with so many other things, is the strongest influence, because that literally is transferring what we call social capital from one generation to the next. The value of education, the motivation for education, the forming those early habits of studying and learning and focusing, which are strongly geared by parental influence. Those in the higher the socioeconomic backgrounds, we see that there's more of a transgenerational effect, that education has done well for me, so I'm going to pass that down to you. We also have seen that minority students tend to perform at lower levels, again, because once again, minority students do make up a higher portion of the lower socioeconomic strata as well. And they've also found that early studies found that minority students going to higher income level schools improve their performance, and that was part of the motivation for the desegregation and integration of schools. But we still see, because school districts are divided by neighborhoods, we know that neighborhoods are still fairly racially segregated, so we still have lots of racial disparities in schools. And then something that's hard to get a hold of is that, particularly with certain groups, there's still negative peer pressure as to the value of education, so that might discourage students from focusing on studying and learning. Now, as we see here, student performance is on the x-axis and increased spending is on the y-axis. And as you can see with this scatter plot, the statistician can perhaps put a slight, what you would call here a slight positive association on that. But as we've seen, that is more than likely coming from the fact that the higher spending schools are in higher income neighborhoods. So it's the higher socioeconomic class that is transferring those values of education more so than spending is improving quality of education. So that's why it's an interesting chart here that we have to kind of take everything into account. Now, looking at teachers, almost 75% of them belong to the two biggest teacher unions in the United States. And so we have a little bit of clash here as far as school improvement versus teacher improvement, whereas the teachers obviously want to get more pay, whereas society may want to improve the school We have approximately 14,000 school boards in the United States. Powers diminished somewhat over the years. They're less able to adjust property taxes in order to suit their needs. And clearly, when it comes to school board elections, public apathy is even worse on school board elections than it is on typical politician elections, and extremely low voter turnout on those types of things. Now, there's a little bit more of the corporate community getting involved, and we'll talk about privatization of schools a little bit more later. But private firms are potentially taking on a little bit more of educating and training, particularly their employees. So particularly if college continues to get more expensive, corporations may actually take upon some of this role of training their workforce so that they would have those people that would come in to work for them. And if it's a huge company, that could provide a decent sized pool of people that would be educated or trained by that particular corporate role. And what we're also seeing is a little bit of a pushback trade-off here, because if corporations and residents are fighting against increasing property tax, well, then that's actually hurting the schools. So property tax breaks is taking money away from schools. So as you can see, it's a constant complex mix of give and take, push and pull. Corporates, entities aren't technically designed to educate society. They probably never will. This will be more specialized type training in order to fill their employee roles. But focusing on that is going to take away the public aspect of a public good. And over the years, the corporate community has certainly become more and more of a proponent of educated workforce, particularly as we move more into a service / knowledge / information society. Our technology has changed dramatically over the years, and so internships, private foundations are all part of this mix of trying to inspire or facilitate an educated workforce in order to provide the people that we need to do our jobs and make our products and improve our profit and stuff like that. But it also has to do with solving problems that this generation is facing when they get out of school. Now, about 10% of K through 12 schools are private schools, but being church sponsored means that they're also teaching religious doctrine as well in those schools, which could take precedence over the 3 R's. And the quality of these schools, since they are not regulated, is taking on faith. And what we also see is that private schools, as with churches, pretty much the last bastion of segregation, particularly when you look at churches. And if people are wanting to take their kids to pretty much a religious doctrine-oriented school, well, then that's also going to maintain segregation, where those are going to be taken to predominantly white schools. Looking at standards, we see that every state has pretty much raised their levels of assessments, and schools are starting to be held a little bit more accountable for student performance. But there is a little bit of dysfunction from this. The required testing in preparation for these tests in order to grade the schools in addition to the students. That takes more time. It consumes much of the school year. There was a study that said as much as 1/3 of the entire school year is taken up by preparing and taking these tests. And there have been some states that, in order to try to get those higher scores, they actually lower their standards in order to comply with the No Child Left Behind Act, which is, as I said before, is defeating the purpose. If you just lower your standards in order to try to get higher grades, that's not necessarily addressing the problem. Now, within the last decade or so, the Common Core curriculum was put together by the National Governors Association, which is a collection of states. And interestingly enough, because of the common pushback against national standards, Common Core is quite often perceived as a federal intrusion on the state's education, but yet it's not a federal program. It was actually a collection of the states sending their governors and coming up with these Common Core standards. But what we see, of course, being a math tutor, I can tell you that 2 plus 2 is always equal 4. So these are just attempts to try to figure out how can we improve the quality of the student's assessment when it's still the same subject. 2 plus 2 is still going to equal 4. And however you teach that you're still going to get that same answer. So this is what's very frustrating, is there more to it than just changing standards and throwing more money at it when the knowledge has still been the same for the most part. Reading, of course, is a core thing that students do, and then reading, of course, introduces you to the new knowledge that comes out. Other ideas have been year-round schooling would certainly maximize the time and space that's there for schools rather than having it being empty for 1/4 of the year. Keeping students connected throughout the year might increase quality of performance because they're more connected from one year to the next. That is also not very popular, particularly when we've been socialized into a system where we've got our summers off, so to speak. Other ideas include making the school day longer. Again, not very popular. So still trying to figure out ways to improve our performance assessments here. Now, looking at various choices of different types of schools, magnet schools have become more popular over the past few decades, to where they are specializing in a particular curriculum, such as arts and music or science and math. So they are attracting students that are focused on that particular curriculum, and they're being attracted through various different social classes, income groups, ethnic groups. So you're attracting quite a diverse array of students that are all focused on this particular curriculum, whether it might be a science specialized curriculum or a music and arts type curriculum. Open enrollment programs are other ideas out there where students can attend that school from anywhere. Within any jurisdictional area, they can go to that particular school. And so then, of course, that has to do then with reputation, as far as, is this school better? Then it might start attracting more people from other jurisdictions. That also results in potentially longer travel times to get to school. And also, if we do have a poorly performing school, and that perception certainly could latch on, then they could continue to leave that poorly performing school and go to these other schools that would potentially make it worse, or put it out of business in a way. Charter schools are another form that has been attempted here, where a sponsoring agency, whether it could be from a government grant that authorizes an agency to set up the school, or a private organization, or a group of investors could even come together and put this school together. And obviously, if you've got big money behind it, you could have a very elaborate, high-cost facility with teachers making $100,000 salaries. Whatever the agenda is of these sponsoring agencies or organizations that are creating this school. And they have certainly a certain amount of independence, but that autonomy varies, particularly when they still have to maintain the same standards. Their students still have to take the SAT and ACTs to get into college, and that would provide common standards that they could compare. There's 42 states that have forms of charter schools, but as we've seen, perhaps no surprise here, that when it goes across the board, there is no consistent correlation that these charter schools are improving the quality of education any more than an inner city public school on average. So this is part of the dilemma. We can throw even more money at it, coming up with elaborate schools, but there's still a bigger picture that we have to address as far as improving our quality of education. It might even be a societal, parental at the core of it. Vouchers is another type of school choice where parents are given a voucher of money, and then they can spend that money on however they want to do it. And so those tax dollars, instead of going to the schools, they set aside those dollars to go to the parents, and then the students enroll in the school of their choice, whether it's a private school. And there's been mixed results on this as well. The courts have been looking at this in different ways. In 2002, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cleveland voucher plan did offer genuine choice. Now, as far as choice being the key word here, as far as quality of education, jury's still out. The 2006 Florida court actually struck it down. Of course, we know that there's a separation of church and state in America, and that provides a very blurry line there as far as people using government funds to go to a religious school. But it cannot be avoided, as you can see, because as I said, the vast majority of private schools are religious oriented. So as we see, the overwhelming majority of the recipients of these vouchers are still going to religious schools, and still undetermined as to whether or not that's improving the quality of education, because they're still going to the schools that we have, regardless which school you go to and how it's funded. We're still looking at some of these same problems. Privatization is tried in some states. We see 23 states have allowed private firms to create schools and manage those schools for a profit. So clearly they are going to cost more. We've seen considerable problematic elements with for-profit colleges, that they are very expensive and have not resulted in benefits from those costs overall in general. And because of the lack of performance, so as we see, as we've talked about before, no matter how much money you want to throw at it, there's no guarantee that the performance is going to improve. So these high costs compared with relatively similar performance, some of those were retaken back because of those. Homeschooling is another option, relatively small percent, about 3% of school-age children are homeschooled. Most states do try to regulate that so that we have some sort of consistency that parents are required to teach their kids at home. And monitoring, of course, is very difficult on this. Now, what's interesting about the homeschooling is that we see generally positive results, but what studies show that is the biggest correlation to these positive results is parental involvement. If you have a parent who is actively involved in their child's education, well, they are going to be better students in general, no matter where they go. So here you have a parent who is even taking it to the next level and getting interactively involved with their children's education. So it would be difficult not to see more positive results, particularly at the lower grade levels when parents may be more qualified to teach the basic reading and writing and arithmetic skills. Could be more problematic as they get older, and we do see that if students are sheltered through home schools, there may be other issues they have to deal with as far as social interaction skills, or perhaps they may be focusing on one particular thing at the home school, whether it's some musical skill or something like that, that could potentially be taking away from the other major skills. Virtual schools simply means that we're seeing more schools that we can learn from at home, long distance, online. Florida has a fairly active virtual school program, 60,000 full-time students that are taught through the internet. We're also starting to see, as you will be a witness to on this class, that we're seeing more online classes at colleges. And I will be blunt right up front, is that the online classes don't seem to get quite the same interaction that the classroom students get. I can see the difference. That's why I'm trying to make this as interactive as I can, short of FaceTime, which of course is an option if you feel like that you need to discuss directly with the professor. And of course, I'm available in my office at any time you want to set an appointment, come by. But there are various issues on these virtual schools. Present test security. It would be easier if a student is so inclined to cheat. Well, it's going to be easier for them to cheat on these virtual online type schools. It's different. It's a little bit more difficult to assess their performance, and because this is relatively new, we may actually start to see some differences in performance assessment because the student may not be getting that same level of engagement, may be able to perhaps put things off and try to make it more self-paced. Lack of engagement is what I'm getting at here, lack of interaction. And the schools themselves could be under scrutiny that could be receiving funding for non-existent students. There have been few cases where schools padded their rolls in order to get funding when those students never went to the online classes. So we've got quite a mixed bag there on our education policy, lots of challenges facing us.